Julia had known Harry for as long as she could remember. They were childhood friends, having grown up in the same small town where everyone knew everyone, and where life moved at its own gentle, steady pace. It was a town full of winding roads and trees that bent over, almost protectively, to shield the narrow streets. For Julia, it was a place of comfort, where everything was familiar. For Harry, though, it was always a place he wanted to escape. He dreamed of big cities, bright lights, and the thrill of the unknown. They were different like that, but that's what made them close. They balanced each other. Julia was thoughtful and quiet, with a love for books and calmness, while Harry was restless, curious, and constantly looking for an adventure. From the time they were kids, they shared secrets, laughter, and moments that, at the time, felt small but would later become unforgettable memories. One cold November evening, years after they had drifted apart, Harry returned to town. Julia was working at the local bookstore, the one she had practically lived in since she was a little girl. It was a quiet evening, the streets were empty, and the store's warm light spilled onto the cobblestone path outside, inviting anyone passing by to come in and browse. Julia was lost in a book when the bell over the door rang. She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat. There he was, Harry, standing with a grin that hadn't changed since the last time she saw him. He was taller, with a ruggedness that had replaced the boyish face she remembered, but his eyes were the same, warm, mischievous, and full of life. "Julia?" he asked, as if he couldn't believe it was her. "Harry," she whispered, barely able to keep the surprise out of her voice. They stared at each other for a moment, as if each was trying to make sure the other was real. Then, breaking the silence, Julia ran toward him, and they hugged, a warm embrace that felt like coming home. "Back from the big city, I see," Julia teased as she pulled back, her eyes twinkling. "Yeah, but just for a while," Harry replied, his voice a little softer. "I missed this place, and I missed you." They spent that evening catching up in the bookstore, laughing and talking as if no time had passed. Harry told her about his life in the city, the places he had visited, the people he had met. Julia listened, captivated by his stories, but she could sense something else beneath his words, a sense of loneliness, or perhaps restlessness, that hadn't been there before. After that night, Harry started visiting the bookstore more often. He would show up unannounced, with a cup of coffee for her and a smile that made her heart flutter. They would talk, laugh, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, reading their own books. They didn't need words to feel close. As days passed, Julia found herself looking forward to his visits. She realized, slowly and unexpectedly, that her feelings for Harry had changed. What she had once thought of as friendship was beginning to feel like something deeper, something she was almost afraid to name. Love, the word felt too big, too heavy, and yet, she knew it was true. But she also knew Harry. He was a traveler, a free spirit who longed for the world beyond their small town. He wasn't someone who would settle down easily, and Julia feared that if she told him how she felt, it might push him away. So, she kept her feelings hidden, hoping that if she was careful, she could hold on to this closeness a little longer. One winter evening, they sat by the fireplace in Julia's small, cozy apartment. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the town in a soft, quiet blanket. Harry was telling her about a new job opportunity he'd found in a distant city. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and Julia could feel her heart sinking. She tried to smile, tried to be happy for him, but she knew she was failing. "What's wrong?" Harry asked, his voice gentle, as if he could see straight through her. "Nothing," Julia replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "I'm happy for you, Harry." "Really?" But Harry wasn't convinced. He reached out, placing his hand on hers. "Julia, tell me the truth. I can see it in your eyes." Julia felt her resolve crumbling. She took a deep breath, her heart racing. I just don't want you to go." Harry looked at her, his eyes searching, as if he was trying to understand something he hadn't seen before. "Why?" he whispered, leaning closer. The words were out before she could stop them. "Because I'm in love with you, Harry. I have been for a long time." Silence filled the room. Julia could feel her cheeks burning, her heart pounding as she waited for him to say something, anything. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was real, she was terrified. Harry looked away, his face troubled. He pulled his hand back, and Julia felt a pang of regret, a sense that she had ruined something precious. "Julia," he began, his voice uncertain. "I didn't know. I mean, I always thought of you as my best friend. I never saw you that way." The words cut deeper than she expected. She forced a smile, trying to hide the hurt. "I understand. It's okay, Harry. I thought you should know." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Harry stood up, his face clouded with confusion and guilt. "I'm sorry, Julia," he said softly. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know how to feel about this." He left that night, and for a while, Julia didn't hear from him. Days turned into weeks, and Julia went back to her routines, trying to move on, trying to forget. But her heart still ached, and she couldn't shake the memory of his face, the warmth of his hand on hers, the sound of his laughter. One night, just as she was beginning to accept that he was gone, the bell over the bookstore door rang again. Julia looked up, and there he was, Harry, standing in the doorway, his face filled with a strange mix of fear and hope. "Julia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I came back because I realized something. All those years, I was looking for excitement, for something different. But every time I found it, I still felt like something was missing. And now I know why." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was looking for you, Julia. You're the one I was missing. You're the one I was looking for all along." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to believe him, but a part of her was still afraid. "Harry, I don't want you to say this just because you think it's what I want to hear." He shook his head, his gaze steady and sincere. "No, Julia, this is what I want. I want you. I want us." He reached out, taking her hand, and for the first time, Julia felt hope blooming in her heart. She could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a promise. It was real as the snow outside, as real as the love she had carried for him all these years. They stood there in the bookstore, surrounded by shelves of stories, their hands entwined, their hearts open. And in that quiet moment, with the snow falling softly outside, Julia knew that her story with Harry was only just beginning.